January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. The German general watched his troops with the confidence typical of veterans of the 2nd Mountain Division, convinced that nothing could stop the military machine that had already crushed resistance across Europe. To him, that American line was just another obstacle to be crossed, a patch of snow and forest to be swept away in minutes. But what the Germans called operational ease was about to encounter a living paradox. In the center of the plain, a single American soldier, undersized and fatigued, was preparing to rewrite all the tactical expectations of that front. The thesis is clear. What seemed impossible under the lens of military logic has become reality. One man, alone, facing 250 elite soldiers and 6 tanks, turned the mathematics of war into a demonstration of audacity, skill, and technical improvisation. Audie Murphy wasn't just a soldier. He was the embodiment of a flaw that German doctrine did not foresee, a human element that no manual could contain. The industrial and technological superiority of the United States found expression not only in tanks and guns, but in the individual initiative and adaptability of the American soldier. In this video, it will be detailed how this disparity between expectation and reality manifested itself on the battlefield, exploring numbers, equipment, and tactics, while observing the incredulous reaction of the enemy. The promise is to deliver not only the narrative of courage, but the precise analysis of how a single man managed to paralyze an entire offensive. And when the fire started, the German laughter disappeared in the biting cold, replaced by the absolute silence of the shock. But before we dive into the details of combat, there's one statistic that defines this story with almost unbelievable accuracy. 250 elite German troops, 6 Panzer IV tanks, and heavy artillery support confronting a single American position, manned by a soldier atop a burning tank destroyer. For more than an hour, he withstood fire from 3 different directions, while more than 10,000 shells fell around him, without his position being taken. The tanks retreated, the infantry dispersed, and the doctrine that had won entire campaigns failed in the face of a single point of human resistance. This cold and unrelenting number is what the Germans would never have expected to find in that snow-covered field, and it guides our analysis of the intersection of individual skill, technology, and military miscalculation. If you value history and detailed research, please leave the like and subscribe. This helps the channel continue to unravel how moments like this changed not only battles, but the very perception of strategy in World War II. The Holtzwihr camp in January 1945 was not just snow-covered territory. It was a mosaic of tactical challenges, every detail capable of dictating life or death in seconds. The bare trees broken by artillery barrages formed narrow corridors that conditioned the approach of the German infantry and the angles of fire of the tanks. The frozen ground, uneven and partially covered with mud mixed with snow, made it almost impossible to maneuver heavy armor with precision, and the American M10s, positioned at subtle elevations, explored every inch of this terrain as if they were pieces on a strategic chessboard. Every ditch, every minimum elevation, and every fallen log represented an opportunity to turn poor cover into tactical advantage. The first M10 was situated so that its turret had a direct firing range over the main German approach, allowing the 50 Browning machine gun with an effective range of up to 2,000 yards to cover open sectors that, to the enemy, seemed utterly vulnerable. The second M10 was partially hidden behind a slight depression in the terrain, its perfect position for flank fire, while still communicating over a telephone line with the 105mm artillery batteries more than 2 kilometers away, coordinating fire that covered exactly the corridors through which the enemy infantry advanced. The irony was evident. The Germans, trained to calculate every angle, every distance, and every reaction time, had no way of predicting that a single soldier would be able to integrate this complexity in real time, using technology and terrain with industrial precision. In addition, American logistical supremacy transformed every aspect of the field into a power multiplier. American production of 50 machine guns exceeded by more than 10 times Germany's ability to supply equivalent weapons to its troops on the Western Front at that time. Every shell, every ammunition, every tank available represented a quantitative and qualitative advantage that the Germans completely underestimated. It was this same underestimation that allowed Murphy, even with a seemingly isolated and surrounded position, to control the geometry of combat with resources that the enemy simply did not possess at scale. If you were surprised by this statistic, leave a quick comment. Absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins. All symbols of the industrial disparity that underpinned American success. Every movement of the enemy could be predicted, every advance neutralized not by luck but by the almost surgical alignment of positioning, technology, and artillery coordination, which transformed the landscape into an almost impenetrable defense. The visible contrast between the German effort and the American preparation became even more evident as American observers calculated the reaction times required for each sector, while the German infantry advanced as if entering neutral territory. The Panzer-IV, powerful and feared throughout Europe, encountered unexpected obstacles: ice grooves, small depressions that made it impossible for the guns to be stable, downed trees that blocked direct lines, and, most importantly, the constant threat of accurate fire from a single man armed with the Browning M2. Each shot altered the enemy advance, forcing adjustments that consumed precious seconds, fragmenting formations and breaking operational discipline. German planning itself, which worked perfectly well in theory, collapsed in the face of the integration of technology and terrain applied in an individual and calculated way, evidencing a flaw that not even the best officers expected to find. The snow, which for the Germans should be an equal challenge for both sides, became an amplifying element of the American defense. The bursts of the machine gun on the exposed infantry produced devastating effects, and each artillery shrapnel directed precisely at critical sectors caused complete interruptions in attack movements, forcing reorganizations that the Germans could not execute in real time. What seemed to be just adverse terrain turned into a tactical power multiplier, amplified by the American industrial capacity to provide enough weaponry to sustain the defense without interruption. In practical terms, the Germans were underestimating not only the man in front of them, but the entire technological ecosystem that underpinned it. Meanwhile, the 50 machine gun was not just a weapon. It was an instrument of applied engineering on the battlefield. Murphy, by positioning himself on the burning M10, not only maximized his range and visual coverage, but also utilized heat and smoke as natural camouflage, making accurate return shots difficult and conferring a significant psychological advantage over attackers. Each shot was accompanied by the automatic calculation of distance, approach speed, and dispersion of projectiles, demonstrating a combination of human skill and technological power that no German manual could replicate. The integration between heavy weaponry, artillery coordination, and terrain elevates the confrontation to a level of real-time combat engineering, where enemy underestimation becomes fatal. German officers, accustomed to well-rehearsed combined arms operations, began to realize that their troops were entering a defense system that did not behave as expected. The infantry advanced in predictable patterns, but every movement was interrupted by precise and calculated fire. Each tank tried to maneuver to find safe lines of fire, but the American terrain and position drastically limited their options. American industrial superiority was not limited to the quantity of weapons, but to their intelligent and adaptive application. While the Germans relied on coordinated brute force, Murphy and his colleagues used the same force exponentially, transforming every available resource into an impact multiplier. And against this backdrop, the irony of German underestimation was palpable. They expected to face limited resistance, a temporary obstacle that would be cleared in minutes. What they found was the combination of industrial preparedness, technological precision, and individual initiative, encapsulated in a soldier who defied expectations of military calculation. Every step, every burst, every artillery adjustment demonstrated that the Holzwehr field was not just a fighting site, but a living example of how American logistical and technological superiority could invert any tactical logic. Even in the face of overwhelming numbers, the experience of that day would serve to redefine concepts of resistance, highlighting that at certain moments, the conjunction of technology, terrain, and individual decision could overcome any conventional maneuver. By the end of this analysis of the field and the engineering of the engagement, the conclusion is clear, but not yet definitive. The numbers, the German tanks and infantry, as experienced as they were about to face something that could not be predicted by statistics or protocols. An American soldier, armed with technological precision and underpinned by an unrivaled industrial chain, was about to turn what would be a guaranteed offensive into an exercise in improvisation and individual resistance. And as the German observers calculated their next moves, a silent confession emerged. This point of resistance was not only human, it was the demonstration of a flaw that no doctrine could contain. In the next block, it will be revealed how this seemingly isolated position turned into a catalyst for tactical chaos, breaking the backbone of a planned offensive with years of experience and redefining what modern warfare could mean in the face of individual Allied initiative. The German offensive at Holzwihr was not the result of improvisation. It was the meticulous execution of a military doctrine refined over years of campaigning. The 2nd Mountain Division, reinforced by veterans transferred from Norway, brought with it the experience accumulated in extreme environments, from the icy slopes of northern Europe to the jungles of the Eastern Front. Each soldier carried not only weapons, but strict training in discipline, infiltration maneuvers, and fire coordination. The Panzer V's, tanks that had demonstrated tactical dominance on almost all European fronts, were ready to advance with precision, while infantry equipped with winter camouflage created layers of coordinated protection and flanking. The Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine envisioned exactly this scenario: armor advancing under infantry cover, support guns neutralizing obstacles, and company officers overseeing every step to maximize efficiency and minimize casualties. Every German move was calculated in advance, every formation tested in exercises that simulated enemy resistance, every advance backed by precision artillery. In theory, the American line should be crushed in minutes. The Germans expected to face only minimal resistance, confident that training and numerical superiority would ensure a quick victory. But what the frontline planners failed to foresee was that an isolated human element, underpinned by American technological robustness and logistical flexibility, could completely alter this equation. Each advancing tank encountered traitorous terrain, frozen mud and snow that compromised traction, while American defensive positions, even limited in number, maximized the effect of each shot. The irony was becoming apparent. What the Wehrmacht considered a standard operation, the triumph of planning and experience, was about to be neutralized by a combination of individual initiative, superior weaponry, and improvised coordination of artillery fire. German officers, observing the first unexpected casualties and the slowness of the advance, began to register in field communications a growing discomfort. The calculations did not correspond to reality, and reality was being defined by an American soldier who seemed to anticipate every movement. For them, that was impossible. Its tactical rules failed, its mathematics was wrong, and American industrial superiority manifested itself in concrete and devastating ways. And as Panzer IVs tried to maneuver in support of infantry, American smoke, geography, and controlled fire created a scenario that turned every planned attack into a chaotic test of survival. Every German decision, rational on paper, was being confronted by factors that the doctrine did not contemplate: human reflexes, technical precision, and instantaneous adaptation. Even the most experienced officers began to record in later reports that the resistance seemed directed, methodical, and almost premeditated, as if the American line had a command that anticipated every German reaction. In this context, the irony intensifies. The war machine that has dominated continents, crushed fortifications, and won battles with mechanical efficiency has found itself unable to cope with the unpredictability of a single soldier backed by reliable technology, abundant ammunition, and flexible instruction. The Wehrmacht's confidence, built on years of success, began to falter in the face of what should have been a trivial obstacle. And while German commanders were still weighing their flanking options and lead time calculations, a quiet realization emerged. No manual, no prior experience, no combined arms protocol could explain or contain what was about to happen on that icy field. A premonition that the next hour would forever change the perception of military efficiency and individual initiative. Audie Murphy was born on June 20, 1925 in Kingston, Texas, the 6th of 12 children born to a poor farming family. From an early age, scarcity shaped his worldview. Hunting rabbits to feed younger siblings was not just a necessity. It was a daily lesson in precision, patience, and calculation. Every missed shot meant a missed meal, and every hit reinforced confidence in his own ability. When his father abandoned the family and his mother died of endocarditis and pneumonia, Murphy took on responsibilities that no one expected from a 16-year-old, turning apparent fragility into strength of character. This experience not only shaped his survival instinct but also developed in him an unusual discipline, the ability to assess risks quickly, and the accuracy of an attentive observer of the environment. When trying to enlist in the military after Pearl Harbor, his stature and weight were an obstacle, rejected by the Marines and Navy for being too small, and by the paratrooper army for similar reasons. Only with the aid of a false declaration of age could he finally join the Army's regular infantry in June 1942. At the training camps at Camp Walters, Texas, his initial nickname was Mascot, reflecting the underestimation of his presence and capability, but it was precisely this superficial judgment that would begin to turn into the greatest tactical advantage of the American front. Murphy did not fight driven by dramatic bravery or desire for glory. He developed a cold, almost mathematical eye for combat, analyzing every enemy move with the same attention he devoted to hunting in childhood. Every battlefield, from Sicily to Salerno, Anzio to Rome, served as a laboratory where he refined his skills: camouflage, silent movement, taking advantage of terrain, and shooting accuracy under extreme pressure. His reputation among officers and men alike grew rapidly. A slight young man with no military pedigree, capable of making decisions that seasoned veterans would take hours to evaluate. The irony was not lost on the Germans. Their doctrine predicted that undersized, ill-equipped, and overly young soldiers would become minimal obstacles, mere statistics of resistance. Murphy has become the blind spot of this arithmetic. Equipped with American technology, sniper rifles, 50 Browning machine guns, and eventually coordinated artillery support, he turned every asset into an effectiveness multiplier. Every round fired, every shot adjustment, every positioning decision reflected not only training, but an ability to integrate information and action in real time, something that the German military machine did not foresee. The same industry that produced thousands of units of armament was now applied by human hands of extraordinary efficiency, demonstrating that technological supremacy only reaches its maximum potential when combined with individual initiative. This fusion of personal skill and industrial power created a symmetry that was impossible to predict. The German force, organized and trained, advanced in orderly lines, relying on experience, numbers, and coordination of combined arms, but was stopped by a single man who operated with autonomy and surgical precision. In every position Murphy occupied, every flank he defended, every sector he covered with his machine gun, American technological superiority manifested itself in an ironic way. What German officers considered irrelevant or underestimated was turning the battlefield into territory hostile to any strategic prediction. Elite infantry and tanks moved forward confidently, only to be met with gunfire that seemed to anticipate every move, a practical demonstration of how flexibility, initiative, and harnessing American logistical superiority could bend the curve of military efficiency. And as Murphy consolidated his position, each enemy advance was measured and responded to with an accuracy that was not learned from manuals, but built through years of survival, necessity, and relentless training. As the Wehrmacht approached the center of combat, the quiet confession in the field reports began to emerge. They had never faced an adversary who was both human and an operational extension of the American machine. A soldier who translated industrial power into individual acts of methodical destruction. Every German officer, in assessing initial casualties, realized that he was not dealing only with resistance, but with the living anomaly that defied all logic of his doctrine. And as Murphy watched the snow-covered field, prepared for the inevitable clash of force, one certainty was brewing in the cold January air. This everyman, armed with superior technology and fueled by a calculated survival instinct, was about to transform the perception of power on the European front, redefining what Germany called tactical advantage, and making it clear that the next hour would be a test of human and industrial limits unprecedented. At 1:00 p.m., on January 26, 1945, the silence of the Holzwehr camp was torn by the roar of German howitzers, an artillery barrage calculated to sweep away any American resistance in minutes. For 30 minutes, the frozen ground shook under the meticulous precision of projectiles falling in timed lines, projecting shrapnel of metal and snow everywhere. The first M10, which supported the defensive position of Company B, was devastatingly hit, bursting into flames that illuminated the gray, icy landscape. The second tank destroyer got bogged down in the frozen mud, its mobility compromised, making the American front line vulnerable as never before. Soldiers, exhausted from days of continuous fighting, could barely move under the heavy snow, with scarce rationing and machine guns freezing in their hands. The telephone lines of communication with the support artillery were constantly threatened by the impacts, reducing the ability to coordinate fire accurately. For the German officers, the situation seemed about to be quickly resolved in their favor. Military logic predicted that this isolated defense would crumble in the face of numerical superiority, combined arms coordination, and the effectiveness of their mountain veterans. But on the American side, Audie Murphy stood still, assessing every move, every point of advancement, with a concentration that transcended fatigue and physical pain. He did not back down, even in the face of the destruction of his armored support. His decision to hold the position turned individual action into a decisive factor on the battlefield, a demonstration of what American logistical and industrial superiority could amplify in capable hands. The irony of this story is that the solution was in sight of the attackers. German superiority in numbers and coordination was supposed to guarantee victory, but the combination of individual initiative and reliable weaponry became the barrier that no calculation could overcome. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content, exploring the logic, strategy, and engineering behind the American resistance. As shells still fell and German officers adjusted their attack strategies, the realization began to form. Nothing in the playbook, no advanced planning, no elite infantry force could anticipate a single-man impact in such a technologically balanced setting. Every second Murphy held his ground added to confusion and unease among German commanders, who began to record in later reports that American resistance was not only obstinate, but systematically efficient, neutralizing the advance at critical points. The field, once planned as a linear and predictable progression of conquest, was transformed into a tactical labyrinth where every advance was responded to with precision and every move had immediate and devastating consequences. And as the minutes passed, the quiet certainty that this offensive might fail completely began to seep into German minds, setting the stage for the moment when the improbable would become decisive, and the next hour would reveal how a single soldier, backed by superior technology and quick decisions, could rewrite the expectations of an entire operation, planned months in advance. At the height of the offensive, when the first German tanks had been neutralized and the infantry were advancing toward the American line, Audie Murphy made the decision that would change the course of the engagement, to climb alone into the burning M10, exposing himself completely, while still carrying enough ammunition to prolong the resistance. The vehicle, consumed by flames that reached temperatures in excess of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, became both shield and trap, its dense smoke acting as involuntary camouflage, confusing the vision of enemy soldiers. Murphy took over the .50 Browning machine gun, a heavy weapon designed to fire 550 rounds per minute, and adjusted his position to cover critical sectors of the German advance. Each burst was accurately calculated, hitting individual targets and breaking full formations of infantry that moved according to the Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine. In parallel, he coordinated artillery fire through makeshift telephone lines, instructing observers to fire accurately within 50 yards of their own position, multiplying the lethal effect and creating a steel barrier that no war manual predicted. With each shot, Browning's brutal recoil tested his physical endurance. Each nearby explosion reminded of the remaining ammunition inside the M10, ready to detonate at any moment. For the Germans, what they should have considered a vulnerable position turned into a methodical, calculated, and inescapable field of destruction, showing that the combination of American technology, individual initiative, and use of the terrain could completely invert any established tactical logic. The irony was evident. An entire doctrine, enforced by seasoned veterans and underpinned by tanks and coordinated artillery, was being neutralized by a man who seemed invulnerable only by his ability to think and act faster than military mathematics. Every enemy soldier approaching within 10 yards was eliminated with surgical precision, and every flanking attempt was anticipated and destroyed before it could consolidate. The sight of the burning M10 with Murphy standing on top, firing incessantly, baffled German officers, many of whom would later admit in reports that they had never seen such resistance. It was not just courage, it was a perfect integration of weaponry, positioning, and human decision. The psychological pressure on the German troops grew by the minute, and the realization that victory might slip out of their hands began to erode confidence in their rigid doctrine, creating fissures in an offensive that had hitherto seemed inevitable. And as the field was filled with smoke, fire, and ricocheting shells, it became clear that this was not just a display of individual skill, but a living test of how much American industrial superiority could be amplified when applied by a competent operator, turning a man into a force multiplier that would forever alter the perception of what was possible in combat. As Murphy held the position, each artillery-synchronized shot approached a critical point, anticipating the moment when the German infantry, though veteran and well-equipped, would begin to hesitate, and the next block will reveal exactly how that hesitation turned into tactical collapse, exposing the vulnerability of a doctrine that never imagined encountering such precise and determined resistance. The Browning M250 that Murphy operated atop the burning M10 wasn't just a heavy machine gun. It was an extension of American industrial capability, transformed into lethal battlefield efficiency. Designed to fire 550 rounds per minute, with cartridges capable of penetrating an inch of armor at 100 meters, the weapon represented the pinnacle of Allied warfare technology, and Murphy used it with a mastery that transcended conventional training. Positioned at a slight elevation provided by the tank destroyer, it had a perfect firing range over the open sectors through which the German infantry advanced, taking advantage of every inch of terrain, every natural depression, and every fallen tree to maximize cover and visibility, turning obstacles into advantages. With each burst, he isolated critical points, fragmented advance columns, and forced tanks and soldiers to constantly recalculate their rotations and lines of fire, making it evident that every German movement was now a response to the individual actions of a single man. In addition, Murphy coordinated artillery fire in real time, adjusting impacts within 50 meters of his own position, multiplying the effect of his machine gun with American industrial power, demonstrating that technological superiority, logistics, and training could be amplified by individual initiative in a devastating way. As the Panzer IVs attempted to maneuver, each volley of the 50 kept them at bay, forcing the infantry to retreat or expose themselves to deadly artillery fire, turning each planned advance into calculated losses. The combination of knowledge of the terrain, reading of enemy movement, and mastery of Browning meant that the German attack was not only halted but redrawn by a force they could not comprehend, a civilian-turned industrial power multiplier. German officials later reported that this was something that defies tactical logic. The war machine that had won battles across Europe stood powerless in the face of a single point of resistance, meticulously exploiting every available advantage. Every minute Murphy held his ground increased the psychological pressure on the attackers, fragmenting cohesion and trust, while infantry and armor were forced to react in a disorganized way, converting training into vulnerability. The irony, patent and cruel, was that the doctrine the Germans called invincible collided with a combination of reliable technology, clever positioning, and instantaneous human calculation, a fusion impossible to predict in any war manual. And as smoke rose from the burning M10 and the German infantry retreated and reorganized without success, it became apparent that the next step of the battle would not be defined by the number of tanks or veteran experience, but by Murphy's ability to turn every shot into a strategy, every decision into a force multiplier, creating the expectation that the next German movements would be stopped not only by fire, but because of the psychological impact of facing an adversary who seemed able to anticipate every action. In the next block, it will be revealed how this advantage, initially individual, began to produce a domino effect that would completely change the dynamics of the attack, exposing the structural flaw of a doctrine that never foresaw such precise and calculated resistance. As the German offensive progressed, the doctrine that underpinned their confidence began to crumble in the face of a phenomenon that was not in any war manual. A single American soldier, strategically positioned in the burning M10, coordinating .50 machine gun fire and artillery, turned each planned advance into tactical failure. Without adequate infantry support, Panzer IVs became vulnerable targets, exposed to indirect fire, and unable to maneuver safely in the icy and uneven terrain. The German flanks, once confident of bypassing the American position, were fragmented by precise, repeated bursts that decimated small groups of soldiers before they could react, while infiltrations designed to eliminate Murphy from within 10 yards were repulsed with surgical efficiency. Every American action seemed to anticipate the next enemy maneuver, exposing a critical flaw. The Wehrmacht had completely underestimated the integration between individual initiative and American industrial technology. For the German commanders, the field that was to be dominated turned into an unpredictable labyrinth, where every correct decision resulted in unexpected losses. And here comes a shocking fact. While Germany produced about 200 M2 Browning and limited ammunition for multiple fronts, the United States maintained production of more than 2,000 units per year, with enough ammunition stocks to sustain prolonged defensive positions like Murphy's indefinitely. If you were surprised by this disparity, leave your comment. Absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins. The morale of the German troops began to deteriorate rapidly. As each attempt at advance failed, each isolated tank was forced to retreat, and the coordination, once exemplary, descended into chaos. The fragmentation of the offensive was not the result of a lack of skill or courage, but of an equation that doctrine did not foresee: the combination of a skilled operator with industrially superior weaponry and terrain exploited to the maximum. German officials would later admit that they had never faced such persistent and calculated resistance, describing the experience as an anomaly that defies all military logic. And as Murphy held his ground, adjusting shots, observing movements, and coordinating air and artillery support, tension was growing not only on the front lines, but in the minds of commanders. They were seeing, in real time, the failure of their own doctrine, a realization that set the stage for the complete collapse of the offensive and for the revelation of how a single man could invert the entire logic of a planned attack with months in advance. The next block will show exactly how this individual resistance turned into a domino effect, not only halting German strength, but reorganizing the perception of what was possible in a combined arms confrontation, exposing vulnerabilities that would never have been predicted by any playbook or training. As Murphy's resistance dragged on, the reality of combat became undeniable. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, German advances continued relentlessly, and the burning M10's position, however strategic, offered less and less room for maneuver. Faced with this extreme scenario, Murphy made the most audacious decision of the battle: to order artillery fire directly on his own position. In military protocol, such a command was considered unthinkable, almost suicidal, and the forward observer hesitated, aware that firing on an ally meant almost certain death. But Murphy, with the cold look of someone who had already calculated each risk, repeated, "It's a direct order." Each shell that fell nearby hurled shrapnel that tore through the ground and burned the snow. But almost miraculously, he held his ground, continuing to coordinate fire and fire on the few enemy elements still advancing. The effect was devastating. The German infantry, exposed and confused, had their cohesion broken, their flanks fragmented, and the tanks without support were forced to retreat. More than a tactical maneuver, Murphy's act represented an absolute symbol of sacrifice and determination. He was not only fighting to survive, but to protect every man from his company. The gesture elevated the battle to an almost mythological level, where individual courage blended with American technological and logistical superiority, turning the Holtzwehr field into a living study of force multipliers. For the German officers, observing that point of resistance resisting against all possible calculations became a source of perplexity and humiliation. An entire unit, trained and equipped, could not penetrate a position defended by a man who combined initiative, skill, and the indirect protection of a superior war industry. Every shot of the coordinated artillery, every burst from the Browning M2, reinforced the perception that the planned advance was not only halted, but systematically destroyed. Clear evidence that rigid doctrines and numerical calculation could neither predict nor control the action of a soldier with access to exceptional technology and logistics. The irony reached its apex. While the Germans believed they were facing only one vulnerable point, They were actually facing a convergence of individual initiative, industrial precision, and technological coordination that turned the impossible into reality. And as the last pieces of artillery shrapnel fell on the M10, a tense silence settled among the enemy troops, marking the collapse of the offensive in that sector. A German officer, later interrogated, confessed that they had never encountered such relentless, efficient, and unexpected resistance, describing it as an anomaly that contradicts any known doctrine of war. The next block will reveal how, from that moment on, American superiority not only neutralized the offensive, but began to reconfigure the German perception of what it meant to confront the industrial and human power of the United States, setting the stage for detailed analysis of the immediate consequences and global reaction to the extraordinary feat of a single soldier that altered the course of an entire battle. In the Wehrmacht archives, January 26, 1945, appears only as a cold line, almost devoid of emotion. Unexpected resistance, heavy casualties, forced retreat. There are no diaries, no personal accounts, no official testimonies describing what really happened in Holzwehr. This silence is more eloquent than any formal record. It reflects not only surprise and incredulity in the face of American resistance, but a quiet moral collapse that no military manual could capture. Veteran troops, accustomed to advancing under extreme conditions and on multiple fronts, found themselves paralyzed by a single 19-year-old, slight, 50-kilogram American soldier, operating a Browning 50 machine gun and coordinating artillery fire with mathematical precision. Norway's mountain elite, rigorously trained in winter combat, failed to comprehend how such a small force could inflict casualties and keep a line intact while doctrine required them to be quickly subdued. Each attempt at a German advance was neutralized by combinations of strategic position, industrially superior weaponry, and individual initiative, revealing the fragility of a doctrine that depended on the predictability of the enemy. The silence in the documents is not just the absence of information. It is the testimony of shock, humiliation, and the perception of powerlessness in the face of something that could not be quantified. The integration of courage, technical skill, and American industrial capacity transforming a soldier into a force multiplier. German officials would later admit that they had never faced such systematic and precise resistance, describing the situation as an anomaly that does not fit our previous experiences. The absence of individual accounts also shows that many potential witnesses were neutralized in the field itself, reinforcing the physical and psychological impact of Murphy's action. More than material losses, it was the breach of trust in the doctrine itself that defined the outcome of that confrontation. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to triumphing with calculation and number, was faced with an equation that it did not foresee, where a single man could reverse the logic of attack and coordination. The historical irony runs deep. The military machine that prided itself on its discipline and sophisticated training was powerless in the face of an individually calculated and technologically supported point of resistance. While the German records remain silent, Americans have been able to document every detail of Murphy's action, turning it into a case study of leadership, resistance, and the integration of technology and human initiative. This contrast highlights not only American industrial and logistical superiority, but also how underappreciated the Allied soldiers' ability to adapt was, a lesson that would echo in future doctrine. And as historians analyze Holzwehr, it becomes clear that the impact of that position was not restricted to immediate casualties. It set a psychological and tactical precedent, showing that the most tested doctrine could be broken by a skilled individual, backed by reliable technology. The next block will explore how this individual resistance unfolded into immediate strategic effects, reconfiguring not only the German advance in that sector, but also the command's perception of the effectiveness of its planned operations, setting the stage for the moment when the mathematics of war was finally subverted by a unique combination of courage and industrial precision. Murphy's resistance in Holzwehr not only halted the offensive in that sector, it fundamentally altered the configuration of the Western Front. With the German line fragmented and the tanks forced to retreat, the American 3rd Infantry Division maintained full control of the Bad Holz Forest, a strategic point that dominated the approaches and was crucial to contain the siege of Alsace. The immediate tactical impact became strategic within days. The failure of the German offensive accelerated the collapse of the so-called Kulma Pocket, where some 50,000 German soldiers were surrounded and neutralized weeks later, making any mass reorganization of forces impossible. Every Murphy decision, every calculated shot from the Browning M2, and every coordination of artillery fire, multiplied by American industrial power, had a direct ripple effect on the Allied campaign. A single soldier turned ammunition, cover, and technology into a barrier capable of redeploying enemy forces and holding critical territories under American control. The irony of this situation was evident to German observers. They had planned an offensive based on numbers, experience, and combined arms doctrine, but each advance was neutralized predictably and systematically, showing that U.S. industrial and technological superiority could be applied with individual precision to produce strategic effects of much greater scale. While American historians painstakingly documented the field and the results, German officials admitted in confidence that the battle exposed vulnerabilities they had never anticipated. It was not just Murphy's strength, but the clever use of American logistics, the integration of guns and artillery, and the ability to seize terrain that had compromised the entire offensive. Post-war analysis demonstrated that without Badholz's control, Allied supply lines and movement would have faced significant challenges. But Murphy's decision turned the action of a single soldier into a factor of geopolitical impact, accelerating the defeat of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. Every projectile fired, every shot adjustment, and every instantaneous positioning decision multiplied the effect of a war industry that operated on a continental scale, reinforcing the lesson that technology, logistics, and human skill combined could alter not just battles but the pace of an entire military campaign. And as the Germans retreated, forcing a hasty reorganization of their forces and recording casualties that exceeded any calculation prediction, one certainty stood in American accounts. Victory depended not only on the number of soldiers or the power of the tanks, but on the strategic application of technology and individual decision at critical moments. In the next block, it will be detailed how this combination of factors allowed Murphy to continue to expand the impact of his action, not only holding crucial positions, but also breaking the perception of invincibility of German doctrine, setting the stage for a thorough analysis of the military system that failed to predict the strength of an individual backed by superior industrial resources. The American victory at Holzwihr cannot be explained solely by the number of soldiers or the superior firepower. It emerges from a structural system that transformed each individual into a force multiplier. The U.S. military model, based on tactical flexibility and decentralization of decisions, allowed soldiers like Audie Murphy to take extreme initiatives without waiting for orders, reacting instantly to evolving combat conditions. While German doctrine depended on rigid hierarchy and pre-established protocols, stifling the soldier's instinct and creativity, the American Army combined discipline with autonomy, allowing each man to apply his own judgment according to the greater objective. Murphy, by climbing into the burning M10 and coordinating artillery fire on his own position, exemplifies what this system made possible. Decisions that would break any classical Prussian structure became not only acceptable, but desirable, maximizing the effect of every available resource. The battlefield was transformed into a laboratory for the practical application of tactical freedom, where American industry provided weapons, ammunition, and unlimited logistical support, while a resolute soldier's mind interpreted and applied these tools with almost mathematical precision. To give you an idea of the imbalance that the Germans ignored, American production of heavy machine guns and .50 caliber ammunition during the period was more than 10 times greater than the German capacity to equip its troops on multiple fronts. If you were surprised by this statistic, leave a quick comment. Absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins. This disparity not only sustained defensive positions like Murphy's for impossible periods, but also ensured that each individual action was amplified by the robustness of the industrial chain, making each decision a factor in multiplying force on the ground. The irony that revealed itself to German eyes was that, while they relied on tested doctrines and superior numbers, they were confronted with a system that turned autonomy, judgment, and technology into an adversary that could not be foreseen or contained. Murphy wasn't fighting alone for mere bravery. He was the living expression of a system that valued initiative, instant reading of the battlefield, and maximum utilization of technological and logistical resources. Every shot, Every artillery command, every repositioning was a demonstration of how the American model could turn an individual into an insurmountable barrier to forces superior in numbers and training. As the Germans retreated or sought reorganization, the growing perception was one of impotence. The doctrine, which worked in conventional scenarios, had no answers for a skilled operator supported by an industrial apparatus capable of sustaining prolonged resistance. And as long as Murphy held his ground, each calculated move expanded not only the immediate defense but also the psychological impact on the enemy, setting the stage for the next critical moment when American superiority would be demonstrated not only in weapons but in the complete strategic reorganization of a planned offensive, revealing how the U.S. military system could make a single man capable of altering the course of a battle, and consequently, of an entire campaign. After the collapse of the offensive at Holzwihr, the study of the tactical lessons of battle according to the German military manual, Verteidigung gegen überlegene Kräfte, Defense Against Superior Forces, published in the post-war period, revealed the profound impact of what Wehrmacht officers had underestimated: miscalculation, inflexibility, and the inability to adapt to unpredictable human variables. German doctrine, carefully structured over years of experiments on fronts such as Russia and Norway, relied on a tightly coordinated system of combined arms. The logic was simple. The infantry force, artillery support, and armored tanks formed an unbeatable unit, and any American position, even if numerically superior in some cases, would be crushed within minutes. However, what happened in Holzwihr defied this expectation. The Germans, so confident in their ability to calculate and control the pace of combat, did not foresee that an individual, human factor, could change the equation. Audie Murphy, with his decision to fight to the end, challenged established military doctrine. The combination of individual courage, technical skill, and logistical support from U.S. forces transformed what was supposed to be an isolated resistance into an event of great strategic impact. For the Wehrmacht, the reaction to Murphy's behavior was a reflection of much deeper flaws in its command system. It was not just a question of numbers or brute force, but of the unpredictability of human action when fueled by such a clear purpose: to protect your comrades. This exposed the great flaw of the German doctrine, which did not allow room for spontaneous action and rapid adaptation. Post-war, the German military admitted in hindsight that excessive reliance on combined arms and tightly centralized control led to collapse when a factor outside of its expectations emerged. Murphy, analyzed as a non-replicable case, represented this anomaly, not because he was an exceptional soldier, but because he was a product of a system that allowed individuality to be a weapon on the battlefield. Unlike the German rigidity, the American system embraced autonomy within an efficient structure, which allowed for flexibility that became decisive in times of crisis. The German military defense manual could not predict that a soldier, armed with a Browning 50 machine gun and coordinating the artillery with precision, would be able to neutralize an entire offensive. What should have been a weak point became the biggest obstacle to German strategy. The miscalculation was so profound that the reaction of the troops at the front was one of utter bewilderment. The lack of adaptation of German doctrine, which had been tested on the Eastern fronts and in Northern Europe, failed to recognize that, in the scenario of World War II, individual skill, when coupled with a superior logistical and industrial system, could create effects of scale that were beyond traditional military mathematics. For the commanders of the Wehrmacht, the greatest shock was realizing that human variables, those that could not be manipulated or predicted as part of their strategy, were precisely what could transform the course of a battle. And as he realized this, fear began to creep in from the German troops. The recognition that victory could not be secured by brute force or traditional methods, but that it could be destroyed by a single soldier with initiative, took them by surprise. The ideological failure of the Wehrmacht, which underestimated the adaptability and unpredictability of human action on a battlefield, was not just a tactical defeat. It was moral, as it revealed a design flaw in the way the German military viewed war and the effectiveness of its operations. The perfect calculation of combined arms, which had worked accurately at the start of the war, lost its force when faced with a reality in which a single man's ability to act outside the protocols of conventional warfare proved as powerful as any panzer tank or heavy artillery. The post-war German officers' analysis of this doctrinal collapse was clear. It was not the fighting force that was lacking, but the understanding of what would happen when an Allied force was able to use its own weapons and resources autonomously, beyond any foresight. And this brings us to a shocking statistic. While the production of arms and ammunition in Germany could not expand quickly enough to cover all fronts, the United States, with a massive industrial capacity, was producing tanks, ammunition, and weapons at a much higher rate. To give you an idea of the discrepancy, in 1944, the U.S. produced more than 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, while Germany produced just over 10,000 in the same period. If you were surprised by this disparity, leave a comment with the phrase absolute power or logistics wins, as the difference in industrial capacity is what ensured in the end that a single soldier could be as effective as thousands of fighters on the front line. With the German weapons system crumbling in the face of American resistance, a new perspective opened up. The Battle of Holzwihr was not just about one soldier against many, but about how superior U.S. infrastructure, coupled with tactical flexibility, managed to turn an isolated point of resistance into a strategic defeat for the Wehrmacht. The impact of this reverberated for weeks, and the consequences would be felt not only in that sector, but on the entire Western Front. And as the German army reorganized, an undeniable truth began to take hold. The war had now become a game in which human and industrial variables became more decisive than any battle plan. In the next block, we will explore how the collapse of the German offensive directly affected subsequent operations, and how Murphy's strategic victory at Holzwihr transformed the dynamics of the Western Front, marking a definitive turning point in the war. After the war, Audie Murphy became a household name not only for his bravery, but for the way he handled the trauma that accompanied his experience. He received the Medal of Honor from the United States Congress and became famous as the most decorated soldier in American history, becoming a Hollywood star. However, the public image of heroism did not reflect the reality of what he lived internally. The invisible price of war was not just the recognition or the visible physical scars, but the deep scars it bore on the soul. The war left Murphy with a psychological legacy that affected his life in ways that no prize could repair. Chronic insomnia has become part of her daily routine, as a constant reminder that fear never completely goes away. He suffered from recurring nightmares, often reliving the fighting in which he was involved, especially the scenes in Holzwihr, where his courage was tested to the limit. Hypervigilance has become a constant feature, an automatic response to any unexpected noise or movement. Murphy began to sleep with a loaded pistol under his pillow, a direct reflection of the constant alertness in which he lived. He avoided darkness, which symbolized the lost control and continued threat of his combat experiences, turning something as mundane as darkness into a space of psychological terror. The war has not only destroyed their ability to rest, it undermined the peace he so much sought. Reacting to sounds as if he were still in combat, Murphy represented the disconnect between the lived experience and the reality in which he was supposed to live after the end of the conflict. The fight was no longer on the battlefield, but within his own mind. Her struggle with post-combat trauma, what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was a silent, invisible battle, marked by alienation and an inability to connect with everyday life. The war did not offer a break for Audie Murphy. Although the years passed, the wounds of the mind never healed completely. For decades, he struggled to find relief, a quest that led him to become an advocate for veterans and awareness of the psychological effects of combat. But that didn't stop him from continuing to fight the inner demons that were chasing him. The true cost of the war, which Murphy could never measure in medals or recognition, lay in his ability to keep living, to endure the unbearable, and to move forward despite the invisible scars. Murphy's narrative transcends the image of a national hero, as it reveals that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to endure pain and loss, and yet keep fighting. As the world celebrated his victories and achievements, the man behind the medal was consumed by a suffering that only he knew. His story, while marked by heroic deeds, was also a narrative of survival in the face of psychological devastation. In the next block, we'll look at how Murphy, in dealing with his own internal battles, became an advocate for war veterans, and how his personal journey helped shine a light on the invisible costs of combat. Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of World War II, never sought the glory that his fame brought him. For years he rejected the label of hero, arguing that his action in Holtzwihr, as in so many other battles, was simply what he had to do. When asked why he climbed into the burning tank destroyer, his answer was always the same: "They were killing my men." For him, it was not an act of bravery or search for recognition. It was an imperative necessity, an instinctive reaction of defense. The soldier who would become a world figure never saw his courage as something worthy of being celebrated. Rather, he saw his task as a reflection of his duty, a visceral impulse that impelled him to make decisions that, in his mind, were beyond heroism. For Murphy, it wasn't about medals or honors. His goal was simple and straightforward: to save his comrades and ensure the survival of his unit. Murphy's refusal to accept glorification was not just a personal trait. It reflected a silent ethic that permeated the way he saw his mission. What he did atop the tank destroyer was not a choice to be celebrated, but an action that was imposed by the situation. This behavior, which for many could be considered a heroic act, for him was an inevitable consequence of his training and his commitment to his teammates. On the battlefield, the heroes were not those who sought the spotlight, but those who acted when no one else could. Murphy didn't want to be seen as an icon. He never sought recognition. The idea of heroism for him was an uncomfortable concept, an idea that distorted the real motive of his action: the responsibility to protect his men and carry out his mission, regardless of the personal cost. The truth he understood, and that many in his position did not understand, was that courage lies not in seeking applause, but in doing the unthinkable when the situation calls for it. Over the years, even as his story has been transformed into a narrative of glory and sacrifice, Murphy has remained steadfast in his vision. In his interviews, he stressed that what motivated him was not the search for recognition, but the desire to keep others alive, not to allow more lives to be lost due to a miscalculation or a failure to act. Murphy represented a form of heroism that eluded the traditional view. He was not the protagonist who sought the spotlight, but the combatant who rose up in the moment of greatest need, with a sense of duty that transcended any idea of honor or celebration. In rejecting glorification, he reminded us that true heroism is often not recognized in the moment, but rather in the quiet, determining acts that, in the heat of battle, are done not out of pride, but out of an urgent need to do what is right. The irony of this story is that the solution lay in front of them: an ordinary soldier, driven by necessity rather than a desire for fame. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the true heroes of the story, whose actions are often not motivated by glory, but by a deeper drive of duty. What Murphy did, what he represented, reveals a deeper truth about the sacrifices made during the war. And in the next block, we will explore how his journey, marked by his refusal to glorify, not only transformed his own life, but also had a lasting impact on how we view heroism and duty in the military. Audie Murphy's impact on Holtzwihr was not limited to the pages of history books or public admiration. His extraordinary action was incorporated directly into the military doctrines of the United States, making it a key case study in several areas crucial to modern warfare. The U.S. Army quickly recognized the tactical importance of what Murphy had accomplished, turning his resistance into an example of leadership, combined use of weaponry, and the ability to operate under extreme pressure. The U.S. Infantry School, in particular, adopted his action as a model to be studied by future military leaders. The lessons drawn from Holtzwihr were not just about individual courage, but about how technological and logistical superiority, when applied by a commander with a sense of duty and initiative, could subvert tactical expectations in outnumbered situations. At a time when American soldiers were facing many times superior numerical and technological forces, Murphy became a symbol of how adaptability, clever use of weaponry, and the ability to make quick decisions could turn a seemingly lost combat into a tactical victory. His action was studied not only as a moment of heroism, but as a profound strategic lesson, where the endurance of a single man, against all odds, could be the key to wider success. Its ability to integrate combined arms, 50 machine gun, artillery fire coordination, and a deep understanding of the terrain became an operational concept, a living doctrine. Murphy was absorbed not as an isolated exception, but as an idea to be multiplied. His courage not only exemplified the qualities of a good soldier, but also revealed how military forces can thrive even when the conventional mathematics of war does not align with the reality of the battlefield. The lessons drawn from his action in Holtzwihr influenced the formation of military leaders, demonstrating that the modern commander needed to be more than a simple executor of orders. It was necessary to be able to act autonomously, to make informed decisions quickly, and above all, to rely on the tactical skills and combat tools at their disposal. Murphy became a concept for the military, an ideal of courage that fused with technical knowledge, resilience, and an understanding of the industrial power that underpinned the war effort. His action was not a solitary act, but the result of a complex network of factors: human willpower, the firepower of American industry, and the flexibility of Allied forces in combat. And while the U.S. military has come to use his history as an example of leadership and resilience, Murphy's legacy has expanded, inspiring generations of soldiers to understand that true military effectiveness is not limited to numbers or brute force, but lies in an individual's ability to turn a desperate situation into a strategic victory. Murphy's impact, therefore, was not only tactical but philosophical, with his action becoming a benchmark for how individualism, when combined with a robust system of logistical support and weaponry, could alter the course of a battle and even a campaign. Murphy's legacy would endure in military academies and, more broadly, in the way modern armies would understand warfare. His story would become an ever-evolving concept, reminding us that the most unforeseen of enemies may be the human drive to protect others, a principle that would be central to the strategic thinking of future generations. In the next block, we will look at how the evolution of American doctrine not only cemented Murphy's example, but how this adaptation extended to other World War II battlefields, turning his philosophy into an enduring strategic advantage. Nazi propaganda, carefully constructed over the years, portrayed Americans as weak, decadent, and, in Hitler's view, inferior, a reflection of a nation whose values, according to the regime's ideologues, were corrupted by freedom and equality. The image of the American soldier, particularly that of the troops arriving in Europe, was painted as that of spoiled young men, without discipline, without the steel forged in the difficulties of war. The Nazis believed that in facing the forces of the Third Reich, the United States would inevitably give in to the power and ruthless order of its military forces. And then, at the center of this narrative of contempt, emerged Audie Murphy, a slight orphan, from a poor family in the rural South with no military pedigree and no trace of nobility in his background. However, Murphy would become the antithesis of everything Nazi propagandists claimed about America. The young Texan, an unglamorous underdog, would silence the words of Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine with a single act of resistance. On top of a burning tank destroyer, with the Browning 50 machine gun in his hands, he would become the symbol of what the Nazis could not comprehend: an ordinary man, armed with the technology and spirit of a country that still believed in the fight for freedom and survival. Murphy's act in Holtzwihr was not only a tactical victory, but a moral reversal that belied everything Nazi propaganda said about Americans. He was the kind of soldier the Nazis imagined was incapable of resisting superior military power. But what they didn't anticipate was that behind Murphy's physical frailty and humble origins was an immense reservoir of courage, dexterity, and above all, a sense of duty that transcended any ideology of supremacy. Murphy, with his resolve not to back down and to protect his comrades at all costs, became a symbol that challenged the notions that Hitler and the regime's propagandists had entertained for years. Not only did he defeat an elite division, but he also countered an ideology built on contempt for his nation and its people. The Germans, who had despised the Americans, were forced to reconsider their own beliefs. They had faced not only a superior military force but something they could not understand: the uncompromising resistance of an ordinary soldier, fueled by a fighting spirit that no military calculation could foresee. The irony of this historical reversal was overwhelming. A soldier with no elite training, no military pedigree, and humble beginnings, he managed to disprove not only Nazi propaganda, but also the notion that the military might of a totalitarian, industrialized regime could defeat human determination. They were not only defeated on the battlefield, they were defeated ideologically. America's superiority was not limited to its industrial output and logistical prowess, but was in the soul of its soldiers, in the individual who, like Audie Murphy, did not bow to the expectations of a war that had already dehumanized millions. Murphy embodied the resistance that the Nazis could not comprehend, becoming, at the same time, the negation and proof of all their preconceived theories about Americans. The symbolism of his action, a Texan fieldman stalling an elite offensive with the precision of his machine gun and his leadership under pressure, would forever echo in the records of history. The German underestimation of its enemy not only led to military failure, but also to the crumbling of the ideas that had fueled the regime. In the next part, we will look at how the Nazis' ideological defeat at Holzwihr reverberated through their own morale, directly impacting how German forces faced the remainder of the campaign, and how Murphy's resistance became a symbol of the struggle against tyranny on a global scale. At the Holzwihr camp in the winter of 1945, the Wehrmacht found its breaking point. The idea of a weak link in a large machine is not only philosophical, it is practical and sometimes catastrophic. The entire Nazi war machine, built on the precision, discipline, and meticulous coordination of their combined forces, collapsed when faced with something that no military simulation or training could have predicted: the unbreakable will of a human being willing to sacrifice his life to protect others. Audie Murphy, in his unthinkable action, subverted not only battlefield logic, but challenged the very essence of a military doctrine built on predictability. The Wehrmacht, with its immense industrial strength, its war machinery, and the infamous effectiveness of its elite units, was not defeated by American superiority in terms of weaponry and logistics alone. It was defeated, profoundly and disconcertingly, by the simple but extraordinary resistance of a man who, in a single moment, by climbing atop a burning tank destroyer, dismantled the confidence the Germans had placed in their own ability to calculate and control. What happened at that moment was more than a tactical victory. It was a revelation. Human power, when driven by a higher purpose, goes beyond what any technical prediction or simulation can anticipate. Murphy did not beat the Germans with his machine gun alone or by the accuracy of the artillery fire he coordinated. It revealed something that the military had not considered: that individual courage, the protection of comrades, and the human spirit can create a force that transcends all numerical and mechanistic expectations of an army. The real breaking point was not the weakness in the German lines, but the inability of the doctrine to foresee and respond to human impulse in its purest form. The Nazi war machine, which for years believed that technological and numerical superiority would guarantee success, was confronted with something that could not be defeated: the will of a single soldier. Murphy, with no military pedigree and coming from a humble background, was not the kind of hero the Germans could understand. He was not part of the warrior mold they respected, and so they underestimated him. However, he demonstrated that day that true strength lies not only in military might, but in the ability of an individual to act when all calculations fail. The symbolism of this is profound. Murphy didn't just defeat the enemies in front of him. He exposed the fragility of a doctrine that relied too heavily on technical predictions and underestimated human variables. And in doing so, he not only impacted the war in terms of strategy, but also changed the understanding of how the military should view human power in combat. He became more than a figure of resistance. He became the symbol that sometimes the greatest force in a war is not the most calculated, but the most human. The Holzwihr event, in the end, is not just a story of weapons and battles, but of how the human spirit can redefine the battlefield. And as the Germans retreated, demoralized, from ground they believed to be safe, reflection on this event began to expand, not just in the context of a single soldier, but at the heart of the great war machines that depend on predictability and control. In the next block, we will explore how this philosophical revelation was reflected in post-war military thought and how it helped shape a new view of modern warfare, in which human variables, previously ignored, began to be understood as the true determinants of any confrontation. Today, the Holzwihr camp is silent. The snow that covered the terrain in the winter of 1945 gave way to verdant vegetation, the traces of one of the most unlikely battles of World War II erased by time. There is a small memorial, where flowers are laid by French, Americans, and occasionally some Germans, a reminder of a confrontation where fate was altered, not by brute force or technology, but by the courage of one man. Audie Murphy, a soldier with no pretensions of heroism, had said, "It was not heroism. It was what needed to be done. These words sum up the essence of his action and, in a deeper way, reveal the ideological and strategic impact that unfolded that day. War, with all its complexity of technique, doctrine, and force, also has an invisible dimension, the soul that moves it. In the Holtzwihr camp, the soul won. By protecting his comrades, by not backing down in the face of adversity, Murphy challenged an entire war machine. He not only thwarted the German offensive but revealed the bankruptcy of a military doctrine that believed that calculation and coordination could subordinate the human spirit. The lesson that emerged from the resistance of that single soldier was not about the weapons he wielded or the strength of the U.S. military. It was about how the true strength of a nation lies not only in its technology, but in the determination of its men to fight at any cost for the greater good. The Wehrmacht was defeated, but not only on the battlefield. She was defeated ideologically. They were not subjugated only by an industrial superiority. They were thwarted by the indomitable will of one man, who, armed only with his courage, precision, and sense of duty, dismantled the certainty of victory which they thought he had secured. A senior German officer, reflecting on the failure of his offensive, would later say, "We have been defeated by trucks and machine guns." This bitter admission encapsulates the irony of a war in which the Nazi war machine, obsessed with tactical perfection and superior strength, was finally won by the combination of massive logistics, reliable technology, and a human spirit that could not be predicted. If you were impressed by this revelation, please like and sign up to support our quest for historical truth and detailed research into the events that shaped the world. Comment below which most shocking data you discovered in this video, and don't forget to activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.